this video, we're going to be talking about carbohydrates. Now, almost all foods have at least a little bit of carbohydrates in them, but in this video, we're going to be specifically focusing on things like bread, pastas, rice, oatmeal, cereals, or things that are made from grains. And don't worry, things like pretzels and crackers, we're going to be talking about them in another video. So, where do we begin? Well, even though when people typically think about carbohydrates, they think about bread, there are lots of different carbohydrates spread among the products of a grocery store. So when we think about carbs, we try to aim for getting between 45 and 60% of our daily calories coming from carbohydrates. And as with most foods in the grocery store, there are an abundance of choices when it comes to selecting which types of breads, pastas, or rice you may be interested in. And when we think about carbs, they can be separated into two different categories: those that are whole and those that are refined. Whole grains in particular are full of various nutrients, including dietary fiber, many different B vitamins, iron, magnesium, and selenium. Without getting too technical, whole grains are just ones that have the whole grain kernel intact, which includes the bran, germ, and endosperm. The bran and germ of the kernel is where you can find most of the nutrients. Some common examples of whole grain include whole wheat flour, like whole wheat bread and pasta, old-fashioned oatmeal, and brown rice. On the other hand, refined grains are milled, which is a process that removes the bran and/or the germ. Even though milling removes many of the nutrients from the grain, many refined grains have been fortified or enriched, which means that they have some of the nutrients added back in. Not as many nutrients as whole grain, but still better than nothing. Common examples of refined grains include white flour products like white bread or breakfast cereal and white rice. Now, in general, we want to try to aim for about half of the grains that we eat in a day being whole grains, and that really starts by choosing whole grain options in the grocery store. For example, let's take a look at some loaves of bread. Before we compare, do you see this whole grain label? You'll see this on packaged foods when they contain at least 8 grams of whole grains per ounce. A similar label is the 100% whole grain label, which tells you that the food item has at least 16 grams of whole grains per ounce. Also, when we're looking at the ingredients list, if we want to ensure that what we're really eating is whole wheat or whole grain, we want to see whole wheat listed as the first ingredient for that food. Now, let's take a look. Here we have honey wheat, one that is 100% whole wheat, one that is multigrain, and the last one, which is white bread. Most of these have whole wheat or grain in the name, so they must be what we're looking for, right? Well, let's look at the ingredients list. Remember, for whole grain products, we want to see whole wheat or whole grain as the first ingredient. I believe only 2 of these meet that criteria. Next, let's look at the protein and fiber content. The whole wheat or whole grain varieties tend to have more dietary fiber and more protein than the refined varieties. So that's great for bread, but what about other types of grains? We can see similar trends in pasta, with the regular variety on this side and the whole wheat on this side. The whole wheat pasta has whole wheat flour as the first ingredient compared to semolina, which is a type of wheat flour but not whole wheat. Let's not forget about the protein and the fiber. The regular pasta has less protein and less dietary fiber per serving compared to the whole wheat pasta. And although the regular pasta contains some great nutrients, it doesn't quite stack up to the whole wheat pasta. We could probably keep making comparisons, but I bet you have the idea. Before I move on, one quick way to check to see if an item has been made with processed grains is to look for enriched or fortified in the ingredients list, along with the nutrients that have been added back in after processing. And we touched on this briefly before, but just remember that grains that have not been processed won't have to have the vitamins and minerals added back in because they weren't processed out to begin with. And on the topic of fiber, it's really important to make sure you're getting enough in your diet. We try to aim for getting between 25 to 35 grams of fiber every day. This can be achieved in a lot of different ways, including whole grains, but also from fruits, vegetables, and legumes. Good sources of fiber contain at least 2.5 grams of fiber per serving, while great sources contain at least 5 grams of fiber per serving. Fiber has numerous benefits, including lowering LDL cholesterol and regulating bowel movement. For people who have diabetes, fiber also works really great to decrease the amount of blood sugar spikes you may have after you eat. This is because the fiber helps to lower the glycemic index of foods and allows your blood sugar to have a gradual increase and gradual decrease as the carbohydrates are meeting up with the insulin that you've injected. This is because certain types of fiber can't be digested, which means that they lower the amount of carbohydrates that can be absorbed by your body. What we're really talking about here is the difference between soluble and insoluble fiber. Soluble fiber can mix with water. It turns into a gel and can be digested, making us feel full, while insoluble fiber just kind of sits there and gets a free ride through our digestive tract, moving things along without being digested. Both are important for our bodies, but we typically want to subtract out the insoluble fiber from our carb counting, since we know our bodies can't break it down. That brings us to bolusing. The amount of fiber present in a serving of food will dictate whether or not you want to subtract that fiber from the total carbohydrate amount. For example, if a food item has less than 5 grams of fiber per serving, you can skip on the math. But if a serving has 5 grams or more fiber per serving, then you may need to do some subtraction. And when you do your subtraction, just take away half of the amount of fiber listed, since we're assuming that half of the total grams of fiber are insoluble. I know this seems like a lot of math, but the more you do it, the more it becomes second nature. And this really can differ depending on the individual, so it may be a good idea to run some little experiments on yourself with your favorite foods to see how this works for you. We could probably make an entire separate video on the importance of fiber and how you should bolus for it. But for right now, just remember that people tend to have less blood sugar spikes if the carbohydrates that are eaten have a higher fiber content, which just results in a meal that is better matched with insulin action time. Now, we can't talk about carbohydrates without talking about breakfast cereals. Some breakfast cereals, including the sugary ones marketed to kids, are not made with whole grains and can contain large amounts of added sugar. If cereal is a main part of your breakfast, try to find options that contain at least 5 grams of fiber per serving and include less than 7 grams of added sugar per serving. We wanted to add some thoughts and considerations about gluten-free diets, as many type 1s have additional autoimmune conditions, with celiac disease being a common one. People with celiac disease have a negative autoimmune response to a protein in gluten called prolammin. This means that items that have things like wheat, barley, and rye are going to really cause big problems for people with this condition. As a result, eliminating gluten is crucial for this population, and people with celiac disease must maintain a gluten-free diet. However, sometimes this can be easier said than done. Gluten can be found in so many foods, including in the modified food starch that can make up ketchup and salad dressings, soy sauce, malt vinegar, and even beer. Cross-contact can also be a problem, which is when gluten-free foods are made in the same facilities or handled with the same equipment as gluten-containing foods. Despite the list of foods that can't be eaten, people with celiac disease still have plenty of options when it comes to choosing gluten-free grains. Common substitutions for eating things like breads, pastas, and crackers can be found in potato, rice, corn, soy, and tapioca varieties. Packaged foods with a gluten-free label can also be helpful to easily identify compliant food items. Just remember that gluten-free breads and pastas may contain more added sugars and less protein, vitamins, and nutrients than the alternative. However, eating simple, whole foods that are also gluten-free, such as actual potatoes, rice, and corn, may give you the same or similar flavors while still benefiting from those important nutrients. If you like baking and are looking for gluten-free flour substitutes, options like almond, cassava, and even coconut flour are super tasty options that are also lower in carbs. Well, that wraps up our video on grain-based carbohydrates. We started with identifying the differences between whole and refined grains. We talked about the importance of dietary fiber and ended with a discussion on celiac disease and gluten-free diets. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and be sure to come back for our next grocery store tour video on sodium and fat. Bye!